Madam President, last week our nation commemorated the 70th anniversary of D-Day. Leo Scheer of Huntington County, Indiana, is one of those courageous veterans who survived the Allied assault on the beaches of Normandy, and last month he made the journey to Washington, D.C. with the Honor Flight Network to receive a hero's welcome from a grateful nation. My office had the honor of greeting Leo and his group of heroes upon their arrival at the World War II Memorial, and Leo made an unforgettable impression with his humility, his demeanor, and his strength of character. Leo's a member of what we now call the greatest generation, and I think easily deserved that title, where duty comes as second nature, where braggadocio is not present, where simply standing up and serving your country in a time of crisis is responded to overwhelmingly without complaint and with true honor and dignity. Sadly, there are a dwindling number of those not only who arrived at on the shores of D-Day in Normandy, but those who served throughout the world's largest military conflict in history. And while those brave servicemen and women are still here to share their stories, at least a few, we must remember the sacred promise that we as a nation made to them, and that was to give them the care they deserve when they come back home. As a veteran myself, my hope is that our nation will carry out this promise not only to our World War II vets, but to all who have served in conflicts from that point forward, from Korea to Vietnam to Iraq to Afghanistan and other places. We must live up to the promise for all who served and stood ready to answer the call and answered that call. Regrettably, in recent months, we've seen this promise broken and shattered. Just this week, an internal audit by the Department of Veterans Affairs revealed that the department's problems have affected 76% of VA facilities. Nearly 100,000 veterans continue to wait for medical appointments. These are staggering figures. In my home state of Indiana, confirmed audit findings show that veterans endured unacceptably long wait times, with some Hoosier veterans never even receiving an appointment. This is unacceptable. And that is why today I stand here in support of the bipartisan Sanders-McCain Veterans Bill that would implement key changes to the existing VA health care system. This is not a perfect bill, and there are some parts of it that I wish were different. I hope that we can manage some needed changes as this moves over to the House of Representatives and then to conference, goes through the process here, and we'll be back here voting on a final bill that will do our veterans proud and begin the process of reform that the VA so desperately needs. Let me address three key reforms in this legislation, however, that I think are essential to our moving forward, and the primary reason why I have agreed to support this. First, giving veterans more choices in care. Perhaps the most important provision in this legislation is allowing veterans that cannot be scheduled within a reasonable time, giving them the option to receive care from non-VA facilities or private sector facilities outside of the VA. This also applies to veterans that reside more than 40 miles away from a VA facility, many of them not in a condition to be able to secure the transportation that they need for that care, and so they don't have to endure long drives to get there. We must ensure that veterans receive timely care, and if the VA cannot provide it, then our veterans should be free to go elsewhere for care, including Medicare providers. And second, the removal of bad actors here. Now, there are a lot of good people working at VA. Their heart's in the right place. They're talented. They provide good care and good service. I don't mean to demean their contributions to veterans' health care. But we do know that there have been mistakes, there's been mismanagement, and there's been some outright fraud, as it appears. We'll have to prosecute that. So this reform would allow the Secretary of the VA to authorize, give him the authority to demote or fire senior executive service employees based on their performance. That is not present now, and if we're going to change the management, it takes more than just asking the top person to resign, as has happened. We need to look at the management team and those that oversee those that are providing the care and what is their responsibility and their role. If a passage here would shake up and shape the leadership of the VA so that those people can be held accountable for their actions. And the third provision I want to mention is providing more VA locations. It's clear that some of our veterans have to travel very long distances. And also it's clear that the facilities currently in place are short of help and not enough to address the needs of the many veterans that are entering the system. And so this bill would establish 26 new VA medical facilities around the country. And as I said, while this legislation is not perfect, it is an important start, but it should not and will not be the end of our work to live up to our promises to veterans. Ultimately, as I've stated before from the floor here and to our body of senators, the VA needs a change of culture. Too many bureaucrats view our veterans as a list of numbers rather than the heroes worthy of our very best care. We have to look at our veterans through a different lens, one that sees them clearly as defenders of our freedom and one that sees them as the heroes they are. And we must continue to investigate and reform the culture within the VA that allowed this crisis to develop and try to ensure that it doesn't happen again. And that is why I've called for an independent investigation. And this bill authorizes the beginning of the process of these independent evaluations. Also, the Appropriations Committee has provided additional funding to specifically allow the Inspector General to conduct an independent investigation into the VA. And I've joined with many of my colleagues to ask the Department of Justice to join this investigation. Now, unfortunately, this culture of indifference at the VA is not new. For years, veterans have faced excessively long waits for disability claims. When I returned to the Senate in 2011, these waits were over 600 days in our capital city of Indiana, Indianapolis. Nearly 2 years, veterans were waiting to have their claims adjudicated. And once we shined a light on the problem, the situation improved somewhat, but our veterans still face waits that are far too long, both for medical visits and to receive their disability benefits. My staff in Indianapolis currently has over 550 active cases that we are working on for Hoosier veterans who are seeking help and getting results from the VA but have not gotten satisfactory responses. And so they call us and say, "Can you help?" And we do everything that we can to help and expedite the process. In many cases, these veterans are just trying to assess the benefits they've rightfully earned, and they just want an answer. Reflecting on Leo Scher's service to our nation on D-Day reminded me of the opportunity that I had to visit the beaches of Normandy while I was ambassador to Germany. It was, to say the least, a powerful and extremely emotional experience. Standing on the bluffs overlooking the spread of beaches from Utah to Omaha to Pointe du Hoc and others, made me reflect on the countless lives lost in our service to our nation. I was standing there on a perfectly calm day. The water was gently lapping on the shore, lapping up the shore. The beaches were empty. There was a soft, warm breeze blowing. The sun was shining. Just a beautiful day. And I was overwhelmed by the violence that must have taken place, that I could only imagine. We've all seen the movie Saving Private Ryan, and I give Mr. Spielberg great credit for making that a very realistic picture of what happened. I don't think Hollywood could, or any of us, if we weren't there, can imagine the violence that was taking place on that calm beach on that day when our troops went ashore. The silence was not there. It must have been a cacophony of noise. Hundreds of ships offshore unloading our soldiers into landing vehicles. Many of them shot down with German bunkers up in the bluffs, built-in concrete fortifications, an almost impossible task. Many of them never got out of their landing craft. When the doors opened, many were shot before they reached the water. The waves, the water was red. The blood that our soldiers were sacrificing that never made it to the beach. The beach was littered with bodies who never made it to the edge of the cliff. And the sacrifice that was made in climbing those cliffs and getting to those German bunkers took many, many hundreds, if not thousands of more lives. And so, visiting the graves of soldiers afterward, pausing to say a prayer for gratitude for their sacrifice, leads us to this point where we have to understand what it is we're trying to provide and why we need to provide it. And that is a response to those who put their lives on the line, and many sacrificed those lives. Many ended up with lifelong disabilities. A commitment to those that we would take care of them when they came back. And they've come back to run into a government-run bureaucracy run amok. If it proves anything, I think it proves that government just simply doesn't do big stuff very well. Without confusion, without bureaucracy, without duplication, without excessive cost. It's not efficient, it's not effective. Nowhere near what the private sector can offer, and that's why I think this provision that veterans who can't get the care they need on a timely basis have the opportunity to use our private system. But they deserve our utmost care. They served on the front line, but when they go for benefit decisions and when they go for health care, they're not at the front of the line, they're at the back of the line, and that's not right. So we can't let the sun set today, and I'm glad that we're not, because we're voting at 4 o'clock to move this legislation forward. In doing so, we're going to make a statement that we're going to try to live up to that promise and do the best that we possibly can. And as I said, this is the beginning. As a veteran, I expect my country to fulfill the promises to my fellow servicemen and women. And as a senator, I will seek to hold the Veterans Administration accountable and to do everything I can to help with the reform of the system. That reform is so desperately needed. The then leader of that effort, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, called the operation at Normandy a fight, and I quote here, in which we will accept nothing less than full victory. And it is in that spirit that I call upon my Senate colleagues to immediately take up and pass this legislation on behalf of our veterans, and then to continue the work of changing the culture of the VA so that we don't have to come back here years from now and repeat this process all over again. Let's get it right this time. The fight to restore trust to our veterans is one worth waging. And to paraphrase General Eisenhower, we should accept nothing less than victory. Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of quorum.